You are watching through the vision block of a Tiger heavy tank somewhere in eastern Poland. It is the morning of August 13th, 1944. The Kupa hatch is sealed. Through the narrow slit of optical glass, the commander watches the tree line, 400 meters ahead, ripple in the wavering summer heat. His crew has fought from Kursk to Kamenets. They have survived 2 winters. The loader beside him shifts his weight from one boot to the other, waiting. In the turret basket below, the gunner rests his forehead against the rubber pad of the aiming telescope. They've heard the reports, new Soviet heavy tanks designated IS or Joseph Stalin, armed with massive guns. But no one in this crew has seen one destroyed in their sector yet. They do not yet understand what the word disaster will mean by sunset. This Tiger, number 23 of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, carries armor 100 mm thick across its frontal hull. The gun mantlet, where the 88 mm cannon protrudes, reaches up to 120 mm at its thickest point. Since 1942, when these vehicles first rolled into combat near Leningrad, that frontal protection has been doctrine, mathematics, survival. The crews have been taught a simple equation. If you see the enemy first, if you fire first, you survive. At 1,000 meters, the Tiger's gun can penetrate 100 mm of vertical armor. Soviet T-34s carry nowhere near that thickness. The standard engagement is clean. Spot the 34 at 1,500 meters, fire at 1,000, and watch the turret lift from the hull in a bloom of black smoke. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. But the reports filtering back through battalion headquarters have mentioned something else. Heavier Soviet tanks, guns of enormous caliber. The crews have dismissed much of it as exaggeration born of panic. The Red Army has tried heavy tanks before. The KV-1 was formidable in 1941, but the Tigers dealt with them once their crews learned to aim for the turret ring or wait for a flank shot. This new tank, the IS-2, is presumably more of the same, larger, perhaps slower. Certainly, the reassurance is implicit in the engineering. German steel, German optics, German gunnery. The Tiger has a combat weight of 57 tons, yet it can reach 38 kilometers per hour on a road. Its Maybach engine, though temperamental and prone to overheating, delivers enough power to move this fortress with surprising tactical flexibility. More importantly, the gun is supreme. The 80 mm TRW K36, derived from the legendary anti-aircraft gun, carries a muzzle velocity of 810 mm. Firing armor-piercing rounds, it has destroyed British Matildas, American Shermans, and Soviet heavy tanks at ranges where return fire was mathematically impossible. The commander of Tiger 231 trusts this math completely. He was trained at the Armored School in Paderborn. His instructors were veterans of France and the early Russian campaigns. They taught him to read terrain, to choose firing positions where the Tiger's strengths could dominate. Use distance, use concealment, let the enemy come to you. The Tiger is not a brawler, it is a sniper. When deployed correctly, it does not trade shots, it delivers them. In the turret, the gunner shifts in his seat. He is 22 years old, and he has been firing the 88 since February 1943, assigned to this battalion straight from training. His kill count, stenciled unofficially inside the turret, is 31 23 T-34s, 7 tank destroyers, and a scattering of lighter vehicles. He has the hands of a craftsman. His work is precise, range estimation, deflection, correction, the fractional turn of the elevation wheel that puts the shell exactly where the armor is thinnest. He does not think about the men inside those other tanks. He thinks about geometry, and he is good at it. To understand what is about to happen to this crew, we must first see what they believe, what the entire Wehrmacht armored branch believes. Since the disaster at Stalingrad in early 1943, the war in the East has shifted into a defensive struggle. The great offensives are over. Tiger battalions now operate as fire brigades, rushed from one crisis to the next, tasked with plugging gaps in the lines or blunting Soviet armored thrusts. But even in retreat, the psychological architecture of German tank doctrine remains intact. Superior optics, superior training, superior gunnery. The doctrine insists that the individual German tank crew is worth 3 or 4 Soviet crews. This is not mere propaganda, it is reflected in training schedules, in crew selection, in battalion organization. A Tiger battalion typically fields 45 tanks. These are not line units. They are elite formations parceled out to critical sectors and expected to achieve disproportionate results. When a Tiger company arrives at a threatened position, junior officers breathe easier. The presence of the Tiger itself exerts a psychological effect on both sides, and this belief is not unfounded. In the summer of 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, Tiger crews proved their effectiveness against massed Soviet armor. On the northern shoulder of the salient, a single company of Tigers from the 505th Battalion engaged over 100 Soviet tanks in a single day, destroying 42 for the loss of only one Tiger. The Soviet formations, though brave, lacked the optics to engage effectively at long range. Their shells struck the Tiger's armor and ricocheted. The German crews fired methodically. Reload, acquire, fire, repeat. It was slaughter, wrapped in the language of tactics. But Kursk was in July. This is August of the following year. 13 months is a long time in war. The Red Army is no longer the poorly coordinated mass of 1941. Soviet commanders have learned combined arms. Soviet factories have mastered production efficiency. And Soviet engineers have learned to build guns that can kill anything the Germans field. The IS-2 emerged from this evolution. It was not a gradual development, it was a response to a specific problem, the Tiger itself. In January 1943, Soviet forces captured an intact Tiger near Leningrad. The tank was transported to the Kubinka proving grounds outside Moscow, where engineers spent weeks studying it, measuring armor thickness, firing captured German shells at it, calculating angles and penetration values. They concluded that the 85mm guns then mounted on Soviet heavy tanks were insufficient. A larger caliber was required. The solution was to adapt an existing field gun, the A-19, a 122mm howitzer designed for indirect fire. The adaptation was crude. The gun was mounted in the hull of the IS tank with minimal modification. It had a slow rate of fire. The shells were enormous, weighing 25 kilograms each, and had to be loaded in two separate pieces, projectile first, then propellant charge. This was awkward, but the gun worked. Trials at Kubinka in late 1943 showed that the 122mm shell could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor from 200 meters. More importantly, it could penetrate the turret from 1,500 meters and the hull front at closer ranges. These shells were not precision instruments, they were hammers. By February 1944, the first IS-2 tanks reached frontline units. They were deployed in independent heavy tank regiments, formations roughly analogous to German heavy tank battalions. Initial engagements were limited, crews were cautious, the tanks were unfamiliar, ammunition supply was inconsistent, but by summer production stabilized. More tanks arrived, more crews were trained, and doctrine solidified. The IS-2 was not a dueling weapon. It was a breakthrough tank, built to smash German defensive lines, absorb punishment, and destroy anything in its path with a single shot. The German crews, however, do not yet understand this shift. They know the IS-2 exists. They know it carries a large gun. But the psychology of superiority persists. The Tiger is still the Tiger. Its armor is still trusted. The commander of Tiger 231 has read the intelligence reports. He knows the Soviet gun is 122mm, but he does not understand what that means in practical terms. He does not realize that at the ranges where he expects to dominate, his tank is no longer safe. He does not know that the equation has changed. The morning is still. The crew waits. Somewhere ahead, beyond the distant tree line, engines rumble. The Tiger crew of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion had received movement orders on the evening of August 11, 1944. The battalion had been hastily re-equipped with the newest variant of the Tiger, the Model B, known to the crews as the King Tiger. These machines weighed 68 tons and carried the longer-barreled 88mm KWK-43 gun. The frontal armor was 100mm thick on the turret face, sloped at angles calculated to deflect anything the Soviets could field. The crews had been told this was the answer. The King Tiger was impenetrable, but the 501st had faced problems from the start. The battalion received 45 new King Tigers at the training grounds near Ordruf in mid-July. By the time they entrained for Poland, 6 tanks had already suffered final drive failures during the 45-kilometer road march from the railhead at Kielce to the assembly area near Sandomierz. Another 31 tanks broke down, final drive units cracked, transmissions seized. The new double-link tracks, introduced to simplify production, caused the drive sprockets to engage only every second tooth, producing violent jolts the reduction gears could not absorb. By the night of August 11th, the battalion had only 8 operational King Tigers. The rest lay abandoned along the roadside or were being towed by other Tigers toward repair facilities that did not exist. The mission was straightforward. Soviet forces had established a bridgehead across the Vistula River near Baranov. The bridgehead was 40 km wide and expanding. If it was not destroyed, the Red Army would use it as a springboard for operations deeper into German-held Poland. The King Tigers were to spearhead a counterattack, break through Soviet defenses, and restore the front line. The crews remained confident. These were the most advanced tanks in the world. They had heard vague, second-hand reports of clashes between the older Tiger Vyanin and the Soviet IS-2. But the King Tiger was different. It was heavier. It was better protected. Its gun could kill anything at $2,000 mates. On the morning of August 12th, the remaining 8 King Tigers moved toward the village of Oglenduv, positioned astride the main approach route to the bridgehead. The terrain was agricultural, open fields broken by tree lines and hedgerows. The sandy soil made maneuvering difficult, and the Tigers churned forward slowly, their engines straining. The crews scanned the approaches. Intelligence had reported Soviet medium tanks in the area, T-34-85s, but nothing heavier. The plan was simple: advance in column, use the King Tiger's superior range to destroy enemy armor from a distance, then push through to the river crossing. At approximately 800 hours, the lead King Tiger rounded a curve in the road near Oglenduv. The commander, peering through his cupola periscope, spotted movement in the tree line 300 meters ahead. Before he could voice a warning, the first Soviet shell slammed into the King Tiger's turret side, punching through the thinner armor and detonating the ready ammunition stored inside. The turret tore free in a pillar of flame and smoke, spinning upward before crashing down nearly 30 meters away. The tank burned fiercely. No one escaped. The remaining King Tigers tried to pull off the road, but the loose, sandy terrain dragged at their tracks. A second shell hit the next tank in line, striking the hull side behind the road wheels. The armor fractured. Razor-edged fragments ricocheted through the fighting compartment, shredding the loader and gunner where they sat. The driver tried to reverse, but the engine coughed and died. A third shell slammed into the same spot, this time punching clean through. The tank erupted in a violent explosion. The Soviet tanks firing these shots were not the expected T-34-85s. They were IS-2s from the 71st Independent Guards Heavy Tank Regiment. Their crews had set up an ambush, hidden deep in the tree line, waiting for the German column to expose its flanks. The range was less than 200 meters. At this distance, the IS-2's 122mm gun was overwhelming. The German crews had no time to react. Their superior optics meant nothing. Their long-range gunnery skills were useless. They were being destroyed at point-blank range by tanks they had been assured were inferior. The commander of the 3rd King Tiger shouted for his driver to accelerate, attempting to punch through the ambush. The tank lunged forward, tracks flinging sand, but the Soviet gunners had already plotted the shot. A shell struck the rear of the turret, punching through and igniting the ammunition. The blast killed the crew instantly. The remaining 5 King Tigers tried to retreat, reversing down the narrow road, but Soviet infantry had already sealed the escape route. Armed with anti-tank rifles and satchel charges, they closed in. One King Tiger's track was shattered and the vehicle lurched to a halt. The crew bailed out. 2 more broke down during the frantic withdrawal, their final drives failing under the stress of extended reverse movement. By mid-afternoon, the attack had completely collapsed. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, which had begun the day with 8 operational King Tigers, had lost 6 in under 2 hours. 2 were annihilated with no survivors. 1 was captured intact, its engine still running, its crew having fled on foot when Soviet infantry overran their position. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The captured King Tiger, hull number 502, was transported to the Soviet proving grounds at Kubinka outside Moscow. Engineers examined it with methodical care. They measured the armor thickness, tested the gun, and drove the vehicle across varied terrain. The conclusions were damning. The frontal armor was thick, but the side and rear plating proved vulnerable to the 122mm gun at combat ranges. More critically, the tank's mechanical reliability was catastrophic. During transport to Kubinka, the King Tiger broke down every 16 km on average. The cooling system failed in summer conditions. The final drive required replacement after minimal use. The transmission's complexity caused frequent failures that field crews could not repair. But it wasn't the technical evaluation that mattered most. It was the psychological impact on the German crews who survived. Word of the disaster at Ogdorf spread through the panzer battalions. The King Tiger, touted as invincible, had been destroyed by Soviet tanks at close range. The armor had been penetrated. The ammunition had detonated. Crews had burned. The mathematical certainty of German superiority, the doctrine built on superior optics and long-range gunnery, had failed. Soviet tank crews were not inferior. Soviet guns were not inadequate. The Red Army had learned. They adapted. They no longer charged headlong into German fire. They prepared ambushes. They waited for flanking shots. They used terrain. German crews began to understand that the war they had trained for no longer existed. A report filed by the 8th Guards Anti-Tank Brigade, which participated in the defense of the Sandiers bridgehead, included this assessment. The frontal armor of the King Tiger was invulnerable to 76mm guns, and even the 122mm D-25 gun of the IS-2 could not guarantee a frontal penetration. This was truth spoken plainly. The King Tiger could not be killed from the front by most Soviet weapons. But the report continued. However, side and rear armor are vulnerable. Flanking maneuvers and prepared positions allow engagement at ranges where penetration is assured. German crews read similar intelligence summaries. They understood the implications. The Tiger was no longer a weapon of dominance. It was a target. Every battle risked an encounter with Soviet heavy tanks positioned in ambush, armed with guns capable of penetrating Tiger armor at ranges where the Tigers could not effectively respond. The doctrine of fighting at distance had become irrelevant. The Red Army no longer allowed distance. They closed the range. They struck from the flanks. They used the terrain to erase German advantages. By late August, the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion had been effectively destroyed. Of the 45 King Tigers it had received in July, only 12 remained operational. 27 required extensive repairs that could not be completed in field workshops. 6 were total losses, burned or captured. The battalion was withdrawn from the front and sent back to Germany for reconstitution. It would not return to combat until December during the Ardennes offensive, where it would suffer similar mechanical failures and heavy losses. The crews who survived Sandomas carried the memory of what they had seen. The image of a King Tiger turret spinning through the air trailing smoke, the sound of shells punching through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable, the realization that the equations they had been taught were wrong. One crew member, a loader in a King Tiger that survived the engagement, later wrote in his diary, "We were told the new tank was invincible. We believed it. On August 12th, we learned that belief is not armor." This was the moment, the collision between doctrine and reality. German tank crews had been raised in a military culture that valued technological superiority and tactical skill. They had been taught that a well-trained crew in a superior machine could defeat numerical odds. For 3 years on the Eastern Front, this had been largely true. But by the summer of 1944, the balance had shifted. Soviet industry was producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Soviet crews were better trained, more experienced, and tactically competent. Soviet guns were powerful enough to kill German heavy tanks under the right conditions, and the Red Army had learned to create those conditions. The disaster at Sandomas was not an isolated incident. Similar engagements occurred throughout August and September as German forces attempted to contain or eliminate the Soviet bridgeheads along the Vistula. Each time the pattern repeated. German heavy tanks deployed in small numbers encountered prepared Soviet defenses. Tigers and King Tigers were ambushed, outflanked, or immobilized by mechanical failure. Crews were killed or captured, tanks were lost. The myth of invincibility crumbled under the weight of evidence. By autumn 1944, German tank doctrine had fundamentally changed. No longer did crews expect to dominate engagements. Instead, they fought defensively, using Tigers as mobile pillboxes, repositioning frequently to avoid encirclement. The war had become one of survival, not victory. The belief in technological supremacy was gone, replaced by grim pragmatism and the knowledge that every engagement might be the last. The 51st Heavy Panzer Battalion never recovered from Sandom. After the disaster in mid-August 1944, the unit was pulled from the front line and redesignated the 424th Heavy Tank Battalion in December. The renaming was largely administrative. The crews remained the same. The tanks that still functioned remained the same. Only the number changed, as if a new designation could erase the memory of what had happened in Poland. By January 1945, when the Soviet Vistula Oder offensive began, the battalion was deployed far forward, positioned in an exposed salient along the front. This was done against the advice of the battalion commander and every level of command between him and Army Group A headquarters. Some historical accounts suggest Adolf Hitler himself ordered the deployment, insisting that the King Tigers be positioned where they could immediately engage Soviet armor. The logic was familiar. The King Tigers were the best tanks. They had the thickest armor. They would stop the Soviet advance. But doctrine built on the myth of invincibility could not survive contact with reality. When the offensive began on January 12th, the battalion initially received no orders. Communications broke down. On January 13th, the unit was ordered to move toward the town of Lisau. During the movement, one King Tiger fell through a bridge, blocking the route. Other tanks attempted to bypass the obstruction, but became bogged down in poor terrain. The sandy soil that had plagued the battalion at Sandom returned to haunt them. Tanks weighing 68 tons could not maneuver in soft ground. Final drives failed. Transmissions seized. Crews abandoned vehicles they could not recover. In the engagements that followed, the battalion destroyed an estimated 50 to 60 Soviet tanks, but at catastrophic cost. One crew, commanded by Lieutenant Ober, lost both tracks to mine damage but continued to fight from a static position, destroying 20 enemy tanks before being forced to abandon their vehicle. This was the Tiger, as doctrine had imagined it. Immobile, dug in, delivering precise long-range fire. But it was also the end. A tank that could not move was a pillbox, and pillboxes could be bypassed, surrounded, and destroyed. By February 11, 1945, the battalion had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The remaining personnel from the 1st and 2nd Companies were reorganized into the 512th Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with Jag Tigers. The 3rd Company remained at the training grounds in Paderborn, where it fought a brief, unsuccessful engagement against British forces on Easter Sunday 1945 before surrendering at Höxter in early May. The battalion commander, Major Samish, was killed on January 13th during the retreat from Lisau. His predecessor, Major von Leucht, had been relieved of command in August 1944 after the losses at Sandom. The pattern was clear. Commanders were blamed, tanks were blamed, crews were blamed, but the doctrine was never questioned, not officially, not until the war ended, when there were no more tanks left to lose. The statistical record of the battalion tells a story more damning than any after-action report. The 51st Heavy Panzer Battalion, across its various incarnations and deployments, lost 120 tanks during the war. It claimed to have destroyed 450 enemy vehicles. This produced a kill-to-loss ratio of 3.7 to 5.1. For a German heavy tank battalion, this was poor. Other Tiger battalions achieved ratios above 10.1. The 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, for instance, claimed a ratio of 13.0 to 8.1. The disparity suggests something about the 501st's experience. It fought in the wrong places at the wrong times. Tunisia, where it surrendered in May 1943, the Eastern Front in the summer of 1944 during Operation Bagration, where it was destroyed, Poland in August 1944, where it encountered the IS-2, and finally the desperate defense of Germany in early 1945, where mechanical failures and fuel shortages rendered the remaining tanks immobile. To understand the significance of what happened at Sandam, we must place it within the larger arc of the war. By the summer of 1944, the material balance between Germany and the Soviet Union had shifted irreversibly. Soviet tank production in 1944 reached 51,000 units, including all variants of the T-34 and heavy tanks like the IS-2. German production in the same year totaled approximately 8,000 Panthers and Tigers combined, alongside 20,000 medium tanks and assault guns. The Soviets were producing tanks at nearly twice Germany's rate, and the quality gap had closed. The T-34-85, introduced in early 1944, carried an 85mm gun capable of penetrating German medium tanks at combat ranges. The IS-2, with its 122mm gun, could penetrate even the heaviest German armor under the right conditions. More importantly, Soviet crews had learned to create those conditions. The doctrine that had sustained German armored forces in the early years of the war, superior training and superior machines, could no longer compensate for numerical inferiority. German tank battalions were frequently outnumbered 3.1 or worse. They lacked fuel for extended operations. They lacked spare parts to repair damaged vehicles. They lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses. The Tiger, for all its technical sophistication, required 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman required 50,000. A T-34 required even less. The mathematics were brutal. For every Tiger Germany built, the Soviets could build 6 IS-2s, and the Western Allies could build 10 Shermans. The Tiger had to achieve a kill ratio of at least 6.1 just to break even in terms of industrial output, and it could not. Most German heavy tank battalions achieved ratios between 5 and 6 to 1, and those figures were based on crew claims, which post-war analysis has shown were inflated by a factor of 3 or more. The actual ratio was likely closer to 2 or 3.1, insufficient to offset the production disparity. The crews knew this. By late 1944, the psychological burden of fighting a war that could not be won had become unbearable. Diaries and letters from Tiger crews during this period reflect a shift from confidence to fatalism. One crew member whose tank survived the engagement at Sanders wrote in September 1944, "We were told the King Tiger was invincible. We drove it into battle believing this. Now we know that invincibility is a word, not armor. The Soviets have learned to kill us. They wait in ambush. They attack the flanks. They coordinate infantry with tanks. We are still better trained. Our machines are still better built, but there are too many of them and not enough of us." This sentiment was widespread. German tank crews who had entered the war believing in their qualitative superiority now understood that quality without quantity was merely a slower path to defeat. The Tiger battalions, once elite formations deployed to critical sectors, were now regarded as symbols of wasted resources. Each Tiger required more fuel, more maintenance, more logistical support than 5 Panzer AVs. And for what? A slightly better kill ratio? A few more enemy tanks destroyed before inevitable mechanical failure or ambush. The legacy of the Tiger and of the doctrine that produced it is complex. In purely technical terms, the Tiger Jet and Tiger II were formidable machines. They had thick armor, powerful guns, and sophisticated optics. In the hands of a skilled crew, under ideal conditions, a Tiger could dominate an engagement. The famous tank aces, men like Michael Wittmann and Otto Karius, demonstrated what was possible when training, technology, and circumstance aligned. Wittmann destroyed 138 tanks during his career. Karius destroyed over 150. These men were exceptional, and their achievements were real, but they were also exceptions. For every Wittmann, there were dozens of anonymous Tiger crews who fought in obscurity and died in burning tanks. For every engagement where a Tiger destroyed 10 enemy vehicles, there were engagements like Sandomir, where Tigers were ambushed and destroyed before they could fire a shot. The mythology surrounding the Tiger, the belief that it was invincible, served a purpose during the war. It sustained morale among German troops. It induced caution among enemy forces. But it also obscured a fundamental truth. The Tiger was a product of a military doctrine that prioritized individual superiority over systemic efficiency. Germany built Tigers because it believed that a small number of excellent tanks could defeat a large number of mediocre ones. This belief was not entirely wrong. Under certain conditions, it held true, but those conditions became increasingly rare as the war progressed. By 1944, the Allies and Soviets had closed the quality gap while maintaining overwhelming numerical superiority. The result was inevitable. The disaster at Sanders, where King Tigers were destroyed by Soviet heavy tanks in prepared ambushes, symbolized this shift. It was not an anomaly, it was the new reality. The Soviet IS-2, armed with a 120mm gun, could penetrate Tiger armor at combat ranges when fired from favorable positions. Soviet crews, trained to fight defensively and exploit terrain, created those favorable positions. German crews, trained to fight at long range and dominate through superior gunnery, found themselves forced into close-range brawls where their advantages disappeared. The mathematics of attrition took over. Germany could not replace its losses. The Soviets could. The war became a race between German skill and Soviet production. Production won. The crews who survived the war carried these lessons with them. In post-war memoirs, Tiger veterans wrote with a mixture of pride and bitterness. Pride in their technical skill, in the machines they had driven, in the courage they had shown, bitterness at the doctrine that had sent them into battle with insufficient numbers, inadequate logistics, and a belief in invincibility that reality had shattered. One veteran, reflecting decades after the war, wrote, "We believed we were the best. We believed our tanks were unbeatable. We believed that training and technology would overcome numbers. We were wrong. Not because we lacked skill, not because our tanks were poorly designed, but because war is not fought by individuals. It is fought by nations. And Germany, by 1944, was fighting a war it could not win." This is the cost of truth, the realization that doctrine, no matter how elegantly constructed, cannot survive contact with an enemy who has learned to counter it. The understanding that technological superiority is meaningless without the industrial capacity to sustain it. The knowledge that courage and skill, while admirable, cannot compensate for strategic failure. The Tiger tank, symbol of German armored might, became, by the end of the war, a symbol of something else: the limits of qualitative superiority in a war of industrial attrition. The crews who fought at Sanders learned this truth on August 12, 1944, when Soviet 190mm shells tore through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. The word disaster, shouted by men who had believed themselves invincible, echoed across the battlefield. It echoes still. Thank you for watching. For more in-depth historical breakdowns, explore the other videos on your screen now, and be sure to subscribe.